This 30th lecture is the culmination of part 5 of this course, and it ends, part 5, with a description of the spectacular Khmer states of Southeast Asia. By now you're probably tired of me murmuring the word interconnectedness and interaction, but this really is the final piece in this complex jigsaw puzzle of these interconnections between Han China in the east and the Indian Ocean in the west. And in this lecture we fill this last little hole, that of Southeast Asia. In the first part of the lecture, I'm going to trace the origins of Southeast Asian civilization from its indigenous roots, which means we're going to go back in time to the first domestication of rice. And then we're going to assess the influence of outsiders, Chinese and Indian visitors and traders and diplomats, on the formation of states in this region. Another important theme in this lecture is the rise of divine kingship, which emerged from Indian roots. It was imported into this region. And as a result of this, over the centuries, the unique centripetal Khmer civilization developed in the late 1st millennium AD. We'll visit some spectacular sites in this lecture, especially Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom, the two great royal monuments built by Khmer kings. If you visit these, the scale of them beggars your imagination. They make the Temple of Amun at Karnak at Luxor look like a village. They make the Parthenon look like a house. They cover an enormous area, and they were built to the glory of rulers. And then finally, we'll analyze the weaknesses of Khmer civilization, characterizing it as a circle, where the strong center preserved the boundaries, whereas a weak ruler at the center would lose possessions at the edges. As we saw in Lecture 17, rice was the staple crop for much of Southeast Asia. There were 3 major river systems in Southeast Asia that were fertile enclaves, which each year flooded their floodplains with shallow water, where long-stalked, fast-maturing rice could be grown. The 3 rivers, with the Middle Thailand and Chao Phraya Delta, the Mekong and Tonle Sap plains, and the Red River and other plains of Vietnam. Each nurtured complex societies for many centuries because this very fertile agricultural environment could generate large food surpluses. At the same time, these major rivers acted as major communication arteries and, of course, as terminuses for trade routes, bringing all sorts of materials into these areas. What you got is something that in a way reminds me a little bit of the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got inland trade and you have the ocean, and it was these rivers that were the link between the outside world and the inner world of Southeast Asia. The archaeology of this vast area is still little known. For years, it has been on the peripheries of world prehistory, and it's only in the last 10 years or so that the pace of archaeological investigation has picked up, partly in response to the rapid deterioration of many of the Khmer monuments, and also because archaeologists have begun to realize that there are many lessons we can learn about pre-industrial states where the archaeological evidence from the Khmer civilization is particularly useful and particularly detailed, especially when you start correlating the archaeological record with historic information. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on the Mekong and the Tonle Sap, because this was really the core of Khmer civilization and is where the most spectacular sites lie. But to tell the story of these states means going back to about 5000 BC. Rice was domesticated by at least that date. We don't know, as I told you earlier, exactly when it was. And for at least 4,000 years, autonomous, egalitarian rice-farming societies flourished throughout Southeast Asia. But, and here again there's a theme which was very true in the Eastern Mediterranean and will be very true in the Americas when we go there. These societies were not self-sufficient. They constantly traded with one another for foodstuffs and other materials. And after about 2000 BC, they began to use bronze technology. At the same time, rice production appears to have increased. After 600 BC, iron technology arrived in Southeast Asia at a time of major cultural and social change. We don't know whether this ironworking came from India or China, more probably India. One day, we hope we will get definitive excavations that will tell us the answer. Here, as in China, the widespread use of iron triggered major social and political change. Now, for the first time after 600 BC, you find larger communities appearing, many of which became important centers for craft production. Something happened that allowed these communities to get larger, and allowed there to be more specialized craftspeople who didn't have to farm. Some authorities believe that the appearance of these larger settlements may have coincided with a major agricultural innovation, the introduction of wild rice cultivation in waterlogged fields, and also the first use of plows hauled by water buffaloes and double cropping. The result of all this was a massive increase in agricultural surpluses. But, as was the case in other parts of the world, such highly organized agriculture required cooperation. It required agricultural labor at a level above that of the individual household. It required, above all, organization. And it seems likely that the leaders of more highly ranked lineages, kin groups, assumed control of the larger Southeastern Asian centers. They were the people who controlled food surpluses and agricultural production. And they used and manipulated some of these surpluses, not only to support artisans, but also to acquire wealth through trade and through their support of craftspeople. Hardly surprisingly, the most complex of these societies developed in river floodplain areas, where populations grew rapidly and trade expanded. Why? Firstly, the soils were extremely fertile. There was plenty of water. There was the annual flood. Rice cultivation thrived. And secondly, as we said before, these rivers were natural highways for societies where a great deal of life unfolded on the water. By the time of Christ, as the Han dynasty was reaching its full flow in China, some Southeastern Asian societies had become highly centralized. They were ruled by an aristocratic class who ruled by virtue of their spiritual relationship with the ancestors. Like so many other places, this link with the spiritual world was an essential glue to agricultural society. And here, rank and ancestry and a connection to divine ancestors went very closely together. They were closely related. And we'll find that exactly the same phenomenon occurred among the ancient Maya of Mesoamerica, whom we talk about in Lecture 32. By about AD 1, The web of interconnectedness was really coming home to roost in Southeast Asia. The maritime networks which linked the major rivers in Southeast Asia had become part of a much larger commercial world, a commercial world where the monsoon winds dictated to a considerable degree the annual rhythm of trade. How widespread was this trade? We have a fascinating example. Indian trade pottery from South Asia has been found as far east as the island of Bali, 2,700 miles away. And with trade links like that, it is clear that there were connections between very distant lands indeed. And we know that in Han times, Chinese ships who visited Southeast Asia also regularly visited Indian ports. You see, Southeast Asia, with its low-lying, sheltered coast, was a vital link now in a chain of trading ports that linked China to India, and India to the distant Roman Emperor. You recall when we talked about later Indian civilization, we pointed out that Ashoka and other Mauryan rulers described in Lecture 26, who governed their empire from the Ganges Valley, were Buddhists. They had overcome Brahmanism, which had preached isolation. Buddhism, on the other hand, preached overseas contact, trade, commercial success. And as a result of this, contacts between India and Southeast Asia accelerated rapidly. Long after Mauryan times, the impetus continued. And it accelerated in the late first millennium BC and continued. There was one inevitable result to this. The patchwork of powerful rulers and chieftains in Southeast Asia learned brand new ideas. They discovered fresh ways of looking at the world, very different from the traditional ancestor worship of their forefathers. In time, they became familiar with the Brahmin and particularly the Buddhist concepts of divine kingship. As we've said several times in this course, divine kingship is a vital component in many pre-industrial states. It was very important to the pharaohs, for example. It's extremely important to the Maya. But no states ever carried it to such an extreme extent as did the Khmer states of Southeast Asia in the second millennium AD. Divine kingship revolutionized, and that word's not too strong, social and political organization in Southeast Asia. They developed a society where everything depended on the divine lord at the center of the state, whose diplomatic and military abilities were all important. These really were states where ability of one man was all important, simply because that person had so much power. There's a term that many experts apply to early Southeast Asian states. They call them mandalas, circles. Circles, which I mentioned before, like with the Shang, like concertinas, which expanded and contracted as different kingdoms interacted with one another. But the key element here was the spiritual and personal qualities of each ruler, because these qualities, in large part, defined the fate of his kingdom. Why? A strong ruler had a long arm. His authority was respected. It was respected among the lesser lords who governed segments of his kingdom, especially those at the edge on the periphery, because they knew that if they rebelled, armies would descend and they would be in big trouble. But if the center was weak, it could easily fall apart at the edge. So you've got this constant expansion and contraction of kingdoms in Southeast Asia, and again, a very volatile political situation. But if you think of a concertina, or hundreds of concertinas, you will get the idea, dozens of them, acting in chorus, sometimes in harmony, sometimes not in harmony. And these mandalas, or kingdoms, flourished in riverine and lowland areas where the populations were high, especially in the Tonle Sap and the lower Mekong. The Tonle Sap being an inland basin which floods regularly. We know something of the lower Mekong states from Han Chinese. They called the lower Mekong Funan, the port of 1,000 rivers. To them, it was a delta area where gold, bronze, silver, and spices could be obtained in abundance, many of them coming down the river from inland. The few Chinese sources we have tell of a swampy land which was transformed by highly organized drainage into an agricultural powerhouse. This sort of transformation requires highly disciplined, well-organized labor forces. In addition, Funan was a transportation hub for boat trade over a very, very wide area. It was the perfect place for this because on the one hand there was shelter, on the other hand easy communication with inshore, and the other hand boats from outside could come in and load cargoes, and yet their movements could be watched. Each major settlement in Funan was connected to the ocean by canals and fortified with great earthworks and moats in the classic fashion, teeming with crocodiles. Funan, and we know nothing of its rulers, prospered greatly from the 3rd to the 6th centuries AD. But, as I said a few minutes ago, the political situation in the Delta was always volatile. By the 6th century, the center of political and economic gravity had shifted inland, upstream to the Tonle Sap, this Great Depression, called by the Chinese Shenla. Tonle Sap, with its annual floods, its rich rice fields, and superabundance of fish, was the perfect place to support dense populations. It had long supported small kingdoms. It had long been a crucible of constant warfare and diplomatic activity. And inevitably, over time, larger states appeared in the region. Rather like China, you just got this consolidation going on. And by this time, Hinduism was well established in the region. Now, devotion to the Hindu creator Shiva became a mechanism for justifying divine kingship. Everything depended on individual ability, with all the lords of the Tonle Sap sharing one ambition: to rule over as large a kingdom as possible. Earlier rulers were unable to cement together a large kingdom. And then in AD 802, and I guess this is an inevitable thing that happens, a leader appears. A dynamic Khmer monarch named Jayavarman II conquered his competitors and set up his new territories as tribute kingdoms. He set up a large mandala. At the same time, he merged the ancient cult of the ancestors with that of Shiva to consolidate his state. Rather like the first emperor of China, he transformed the vision of the world. And he made sure that his subjects worshipped him as a god. Jayavarman was a god king. All of the sources of an increasingly centralized government preserved the cult of the god king. Everyone was expected to subordinate any individual ambitions they had to perpetuate the existence of the king on earth and his identity with the god in the next life as well as this one. Jayavarman II ruled for 45 years, like Egyptian pharaohs. Longevity of rule and ability almost invariably meant a stable kingdom which progressed. He was the first of 3 dynasties of Khmer rulers who presided over a volatile state that reached the height of its prosperity between AD 900 and 1200, the period roughly of medieval times in Europe. The Khmer king was the Varman, the protector, and his noble priests, who served his every wish and need, were the instruments of political power. The noble families presided over a bureaucracy of patronage, which supervised every aspect of Khmer life, controlling labor forces and food surpluses raised by very, very carefully controlled and taxed agriculture, and also by tribute. They served the god. They served the king. For instance, the most important ritual of all was the custom of building a magnificent temple to house the royal linga, the phallic emblem of creative power. And this spilled over into an extraordinary investment by the 30 rulers who followed Jayavarman II in massive shrines on mounds in an area called Angkor, which was the hub of the Khmer universe. And this is where the greatest Khmer archaeological sites are to be found. The cult of the divine king reached its height when King Suryavarman II built the great temple of Angkor Wat in AD 1117. Angkor Wat is the largest religious building in the world. It beggars the imagination. It dwarfs the largest Sumerian ziggurat. It dwarfs the pyramids of Giza. It dwarfs the Parthenon, Tikal, and great Maya cities. It is, quite simply, colossal. Every detail of the temple, of this great structure, reproduced the heavenly world in a terrestrial mode. The highest tower represented the cosmic mountain, Meru, where the gods lived. The remaining 4 towers depict Meru's lesser peaks. A great enclosure wall depicts the mountains at the edge of the world, the surrounding moat, the ocean beyond. A model, a symbolic model of the cosmos. You find that Mesoamerican rulers did the same thing. They built their cities as symbolic models of their world. During his lifetime, Suryavarman used the temple as a palace. When he died, his remains were buried in the central tower so that his soul entered the divine image and made contact with the royal ancestors. He became as one with Vishnu, the master of the universe. Angkor Wat really taxed the resources of the kingdom at a time of vicious strife with neighboring kingdoms. But that didn't deter Jayavarman. He ordered the walls of Angkor Wat covered with the most magnificent friezes of sensuous dancing girls, of armies with war elephants advancing into battle, of all the glorification of his rule, his kingdom, and the cosmos. It is, quite simply, a masterpiece, but a masterpiece built at enormous cost. This was a centripetal empire. Everything flowed to the center for the benefit of a divine king. Far more than a pyramid, it was completely centralized. In AD 1181, King Jayavarman VII, who was a Buddhist, started building a huge new capital at Angkor Thom nearby. Another vast work. It doesn't quite have the impact to the visitor that Angkor Wat does, because it's more spread out. But a dark and forbidding 8-mile wall surrounds what was his capital with its grand plaza, where ceremonies and contests and vast military reviews were staged. As many as 1 million people lived in or near Angkor Thom, which today is partially overgrown. The statistics from the temples speak for themselves. Jayavarman dedicated the Tar Prom temple nearby to his mother in the image of Buddha's mother. An inscription records that 306,372 people from 13,500 villages worked for the shrine, consuming 38,000 tons of rice annually. These figures may be exaggerated, but one suspects that the cost was close to that. All of this stupendous construction was designed to make merit for the king and his rich followers. You served the king by giving gifts to him and making construction. His projects created a totally centripetal religious utopia in which every product, every person's labor embellished the hub of the universe and the kings who enjoyed it. The ruler's power depended on the granting of favors, on his successful patronizing of the major aristocratic families. There was no stable bureaucracy like there was in Egypt. There were no appointed officials to run the state as there were in China. A king's hold in power depended entirely on his ability to control the center, the Angkor. Now, a strong monarch like Jayavarman VII commanded the loyalty of the aristocrats who ruled the outlying boundaries of the kingdom. But the moment it was weak at the center, the periphery tended to break off. And this kingdom, in a way, was like a ripe apple waiting to be plucked from a tree. In AD 1430-31, just before Columbus sailed to the Indies, a Thai army from the west besieged Angkor, and the magnificent Khmer kingdom dissolved quickly, and the great temples and palaces dissolved, overgrown into the rainforest again. But by this time, there'd been changes in the outside world. The strategic trade routes, the web of interconnection to India, had now come under the influence of an expanding Islam. The port of Malacca on the islands became an important center in a new, much bigger international spice trade. Even more important than this, the new religion preached a message of religious egalitarianism in the face of centuries of divine rule, which were based ultimately on Indian notions of kingship. No longer was the king the pinnacle. And very rapidly, the Khmer world dissolved and became just a memory. So in this lecture, we've filled in the final bit of this web of interconnection. We've shown how Southeast Asian civilization was a mixture of indigenous development, of religious ideas and notions of kingship from outside. We've shown how divine kingship developed in the Tonle Sap into this extraordinary centripetalized, almost self-destructive form of states, the results of which architecturally were masterpieces. Everything was spent to glorify the ruler and the gods. And we've shown how this rapidly collapsed in the face of outside Islam and invasion. And with this, we come to the end of our exploration of the Old World. And in the next lectures, we will go to the Americas.